What's up everyone, my name is Rosendo and welcome back to my channel, and we are back with another video, and today we are back with another track review series. I believe we are now at episode 10 of our track review series, taking a look at Wilderness by Mitis today. Another future-based track, which depending on how you define it, brings us to the third future-based track, melodic-based track that we are taking a look at, where today we're going to talk a little bit about lyrics. We're going to talk some things that we've talked about in the past. We're talking about symmetry today as well, but we're finally taking a look at lyrics today because this is the first track that I would say needs us to take a look at the lyrics in order to give it a fair rating. So stay tuned for that. Make sure to like and subscribe, but without further ado, let's hop into Spotify. All right, we are back in Spotify taking a look at Wilderness by Mitis, jerseyed up again if you saw episode number 8, which was the Nurko breakdown, where we take a look at Mitis, an artist that I also really like, an artist that I've seen live twice, a really good set. And let's also take a look at a quick breakdown of my history with Mitis as we did with Nurko. Right here we can see Mitis's appearances on my playlist. One of the first artists I discovered with Foundations in 2019, but I think I might have just actually, this probably right around the time I was getting into EDM and right around the time that I discovered Mitis. A few more other releases, definitely some Ophelia records released, a few 2025 releases, and notably the one thing I wanted to call attention to is an appearance out of his album Lost, which for some reason I didn't add many tracks from his album on here, but one of my favorite albums of all time. I think it's a really, really well done melodic bass album. I haven't listened to many melodic bass albums through and through, fully immersed, but I would say this is a very good one. It does a lot of really good things. I like the pacing, I like the direction, and overall just has some really nice tracks that work together really well to have a story, have a journey, have a progression to it. So definitely wanted to call attention to this. Pretty big fan of Mitis, really, really big fan of this album. Now we are taking a look at his latest release, Wilderness, which came out over the weekend, February 27th, 2026, a 3-minute and 58-second melodic bass track, which we are going to review today. Now for the preface, before we get into listening to this track, there is one main thing I want to focus on, which is lyrics. Today is finally the day where we get to talk about lyrics, my opinions on them, and I'll try not to be too harsh because I mentioned in the past that I'm really, really, really picky about my lyrics. So I'm going to propose a few ideas and propose a few questions for you guys to consider. Something I kind of touched on last video. I touched on it a little bit in the Nurko's Longest Night, and that's definitely something that I'm going to talk about in this video that I think we need to talk about this video, because if you saw the Nurko Longest Night video, I mentioned kind of some criteria for when we need to consider lyrics, which we didn't have to in that video, but we will have to here. I also mentioned that we are going to talk about symmetry, but that's more of a characteristic of this track that goes hand in hand with the need to talk about lyrics, but I'll mention that when the time is appropriate after we listen to the track, because the first thing we need to do is listen to the track. So why don't we actually get to it, taking a look at Wilderness by Mitis. As a reminder, there will be no audio playing for copyright reasons, but we can all listen to the track at the same time with Wilderness by Mitis in 3, 2, 1. We're going to talk about pacing as well, starting off with 4 bars into a 4-bar intro into the verse. Pretty standard stuff for melodic bass right now, you know, it's really stripped, emphasis on the vocals, pay attention to that. You have some intervals, you have some sounds, some background noises, but for the most part, the lyrics and the vocals are the main player, similar to the Longest Night video and not as similar to Deepest Veils. I really like that lead note that transitions with the vocals, but I probably won't say much here because, as I mentioned, the attention will be on the lyrics. I definitely won't say much for the second verse. You get those cutoffs, you get the plucks, you get an arp. Vocals are kind of moving with the slowed down halftime drums. Into the build-up, really nice plucks. So far, pretty standard for Mitis' sound, a sound that I'm pretty familiar with. Again, we're going to talk all things about the track probably in the first half, and I won't say much for the second half. Into a build-up that feels a little bit more stripped. Definitely a more inactive track compared to last track, which I like, but we're going to see if it does any favors after the first drop. Into a drop that's pretty standard for Mitis. Again, sounds I like. I like melodic bass, I like future bass, melodic dubstep, whatever you want to call it. So all things that I'm a fan of right now, for the most part. There's that lead. Pretty standard stuff. Again, not too many things to say about the drop because to me it's just so standard Mitis. Let's take a listen to the track now and really pay attention to lyrics. Actually, you bring the track down a little bit for another 4 bars in the middle. And now let's listen. Really nice piano. And so far, everything feels very symmetrical. I would say it is symmetrical. I'm not sure if it's 100%, but it's probably 95 or 99% symmetrical. And your second drop right there with, again, that little bit of a, not necessarily a fake out, but drumless drop, we'll just call it, into the second drop. Again, another drop, a second drop that feels very similar, symmetrical to the first, we'll say. And again, that's pretty much everything I wanted to call attention to, except for this part right here. Where we bring back Rosendo versus the Crash outro. We'll talk about that later. And that was Wilderness by Mitis. All right, so let's actually analyze this track, because as I mentioned, the main thing I want to call attention to is lyrics. Before we call attention to lyrics, let's talk about why I think we need to call attention to lyrics by talking about the characteristics of this track. Number one, very standard for Mitis' sound. Nothing really stuck out to me. I like his sound. I wouldn't like him as an artist if I didn't like his sound. So, but for other than that, pretty standard for his sound. Number two, let's talk about the pacing. I normally talk a lot about pacing, but I'm going to keep it brief because A, we've talked about it a lot already, and B, it's not really an important factor of this track. So I just want to briefly mention what I noticed, because in the last video I talked about 4-bar intros, or what I've since described as intros that are half the pacing of the track. The interesting thing about this, and something I actually like about this, is that the intro is 4 bars, and I have said that the pacing of the track is usually 8 bars, and that's almost always the case 99% of the time, but that's not just about when you add something new, it's more about how the track moves and how the pacing of the track feels. Where in Save My Love by Kygo, Khalid, and Griffin, it definitely felt like the track moved in 8-phrase blocks. Here, the track also moves in 8-phrase blocks, but you get a little bit more repetition within each phrase, with every 4 bars, you get a little bit of repetition. As in, for example, let's take a 4-bar intro, and then we have 8 bars after that. In those 8 bars, the 4 bars kind of repeat themselves into 2, which kind of gives it a 4-bar pacing. So although this track has a 4-bar intro and you get new elements every 8 bars, the fact that elements repeat every 4 bars kind of gives it a 4-bar pacing. Again, very important detail I wanted to call attention to, because I always talk about movement and pacing of tracks, and even though it might just be as simple as saying, hey, every 8 bars, artist add something new, here it's about the feel. Mitis made a very intentional decision, or whoever produced it. Credit time. Mitis and the writers and arrangers made very intentional decisions to repeat melodies every 4 bars to kind of give it that 4-bar feel. And that's something I want to call attention to, because it's easy to say that every track has an 8-bar pacing. It's about more than that. It's about the feel and about the decisions you make that kind of repeat certain patterns. And this is especially true in kind of progressive trance and progressive house tracks, which we haven't covered, but I definitely want to cover at one point, and we definitely will at one point. But it's especially true to recognize that not every track is going to have an 8-bar pacing, or B, feel like it has an 8-bar pacing. This one definitely feels like a 4-bar pacing. So there's your 4-bar intro into what feels like a 4-bar pacing, an intro that matches the pacing of the track, even though it's 4 bars in this case. All right, and good. That about does it. Let's quickly talk about the characteristics of the track before we talk about the lyrics. Let's take 30 seconds just to talk about it. 4-bar intro into some standard verses, into a very standard Mitis drop, again, that I like, into a track that feels very, very symmetrical, right? You have the intro, you have the verses, the build-ups, verses build up into a drop, which actually kind of brings the energy down, which actually kind of hurts the structure and arrangement a little bit because it feels even more like a reset. So overall, the track feels pretty symmetrical. We're going to expand on that. But finally, of course, you have a crash outro, which I mentioned in the Longest Night video that I really like the outro. I mentioned the Save My Love video that I don't want to take those outros for granted. And I don't know how many crash outros we've looked at this point. Save My Love, definitely Outlook and Millennium, the most infamous example of that. And I want to say there was probably a few more in there. But you guys already know how I feel about crash outros. Today, we're not talking about crash outros. We're talking about lyrics. So let's talk about arrangement, why we need to look at the lyrics, and the actual lyrics. All right, so the main section of this track review. Let's talk about arrangement first, because when it comes to progression, I want to say I mentioned this in either video number 1, I actually don't have no clue when I mentioned this. It actually could have been in one of my progression breakdown videos. I said before that when the first verse and the second verse are exactly the same, and the lyrics melodically are exactly the same, and the vocals melodically are exactly the same, and the only thing you change is the lyrics, I've never ever really been a fan of that progression. Frankly, I wouldn't even consider it progression because nothing else about the track is changing. The only thing you changed are the words, but the melodies, even if you change the words and you change the syllables and the rhythm, that would work, but here, or at least in general when I say, but when the melodies are the same, the rhythms are the same, and the only things that are changing is the actual words, it always feels not only like there's a lack of progression, but it feels exactly, to me, it's effectively as if I'm hearing exactly the same thing as the first verse. So when we're talking about arrangement, when we're talking about vocals here, when we hear things that feel exactly the same, that's when we need to take a step back and think, okay, the arrangement is effectively the same, the melodies are the same. Do we need to dive a little bit deeper? Now let's talk about the other thing, which is what I mentioned in the Longest Night video, Nurko, episode number 8, a track that I gave a lot of praise for, which also goes hand in hand with what I talked about in Deepest Veils. I mentioned in those videos that oftentimes you can have melodic bass tracks that are more stripped and the attention is on the lyrics. And that's when you might actually have to consider how the lyrics play a role into the track. In Deepest Veils, I said we didn't have to consider them because the attention was not on the lyrics. In The Longest Night, I said the attention was on the lyrics, but the track does other things already really well that I don't think we need to consider the lyrics. Even if the lyrics did have empty emotion, the vocals themselves already do a really good job on the track, right? When the vocals don't do a good job, and the emphasis is on the vocals, then you have to look at the lyrics and be like, okay, maybe the lyrics are contributing something. This is a track where, because of its symmetry, because of its lack of progression, when we're looking for things that we want to consider, when we're looking for things that we want to analyze and to some extent critique and review, when there's no progression, when you have such a symmetrical track, when the sound is pretty much something you've already done before, that's when we need to take a step back and be like, okay, we've gotten so far pretty average stuff. Nothing that really sticks out, nothing that has given us any sort of significant features or characteristics. What about the lyrics? Let's take this final avenue and let's look at that and let's see if this contributes something to the track. And that's why I think today is the day where not only A, we're going to look at lyrics, but B, we've reached a track where we actually need to. Now, if you saw my Deepest Veil review, I want to say episode number 5, I talked about how future bass and melodic bass tracks tend to have pretty empty lyrics, or lyrics that what I described as contributing empty emotion, which is essentially when, as I said in that video, when artists write lyrics and they write vocals, but they write lyrics to tracks that the words and the words themselves have emotion to them, but oftentimes it just feels like empty emotion. It just feels like you're writing emotional things, but not actually including any emotion as the writer, as the artist, or as the producer, as the composer. You're just including lyrics and words that can evoke emotion or that have emotional components to them, but aren't actually emotional in and of themselves, i.e. you just included emotional lyrics to include emotional lyrics. So when we look at this track and when we actually look at the lyrics, it seems like the theme of the lyrics is kind of like the outdoor and, you know, I don't know, discovering yourself, finding yourself, belonging there and feeling like you're someone else, something along those lines. Those are for you to analyze because in my opinion, I said before, I'm very picky about lyrics. I'm not too big of a fan of these lyrics. Now that we actually have to look at them, to me, they strike me as more empty emotional lyrics that you see out of a lot of future bass tracks. But B, that's just my opinion. Other than that, I want you guys to listen to the lyrics. What do you guys think? Do you guys think that A, they are emotional as lyrics themselves? B, they are inherently emotional. Do they come from somewhere meaningful? Is the artist looking to contribute something with those lyrics? Or C, is there a deeper intention behind them? Why did they make that theme? Why are they talking about these things? Why do they choose those words? Why do they want to tell this story? These are all the things that A, I think that should be taken into consideration when writing and presenting lyrics. And B, I've always urged artists to take every single decision they make in their track as an intentional decision and take into consideration why they make every decision. And that absolutely extends to the lyrics, especially when you have a track that is very consistent and average across your style and your repertoire. And then when you write the lyrics, that's when you really need to take into consideration what you're going to contribute with that track via the lyrics. So there you go. What do you guys think about the lyrics? Let me know what you think in the comments. That being said, to me, they strike me as another set of generic, empty, emotional, melodic bass lyrics. Is the theme there? The theme is there, right? It's not about love or anything, which we get a lot of in future bass, like love breakup stories and stuff like that. I will applaud the fact that it's a little bit different here, but again, it's hard to say if they come from an actual, if they come from somewhere meaningful, if they come with intention, if they come from an actual background or desire to tell a very specific story or to share a very specific emotion that actually has, again, some kind of meaning or background to it, or if it's just another attempt at writing what wants to be emotional melodic bass lyrics. And for the one viewer watching this, if this happens to get to 2 viewers and maybe someone who worked on this track wants to respond, this would be a perfect opportunity for, someone from the team to say, hey, you know what? Maybe there was a background behind it, maybe there wasn't, or maybe the theme alone was something they wanted to convey with this track and avoid the whole breakup thing. But again, as of right now, with my set of information and with my assumptions, that's very important because these are not just my beliefs, but these are my assumptions that I'm making. They feel like empty emotion lyrics, and assuming they are empty emotion lyrics without any more information to the contrary, I'm going to assume they are, and I'm going to conclude that I'm not a big fan of these lyrics. All right, and with that being said, we can get into my final rating. The biggest thing I wanted to mention there is, because this track is A, very symmetrical, and B, lacks any sort of meaningful progression, and C, as I mentioned, is a very standard sound for this artist, there's not much we can really look at or kind of review positively unless we look at the lyrics. And now that we have looked all that, for all those reasons, very similar to the Save My Love rating, where we have a symmetrical track, no progression, a pretty average sound, a sound that I like. Again, I like Mitis' sound, and I like future melodic bass, and I really do like his sound. But again, pretty standard sound for him, and lyrics that contribute empty emotion. It probably leads us to the rational conclusion where we stamp this at, say, similar to Save My Love, a 4 out of 10. Like I said, not really many scenarios where you give any tracks a 3 or a 2 or a 1. It's really hard to say. Maybe we'll, I don't think you can. And even if you did, you have to recognize that it's it is subjective, and it's hard to maybe find a track you would give an objective rating. It would have to just break rules really badly. And when I say rules, I don't mean that there are rules in music production. I just mean that, you're basically messing things up almost intentionally, or you didn't put any effort and things are messed up. In this case, you have what feels like an average sound and progression left to be desired with empty lyrics. You pretty much stamp it at a 4 out of 10 unless given information that would prove the contrary, i.e. if this was a very standard symmetrical track with a standard sound and limited progression, but you found out that it was telling a much deeper, meaningful story from an artist or a writer or a producer that not just A, wanted to convey a theme, but B, really came from somewhere emotional and intentional and had some background to it, then you could probably, and I might even say correctly say, this would be a 5 out of 10 track. But until that information, and again, I want to emphasize not only are A, these are my opinions, but B, these are based off assumptions. Until then, we stamp this at Wilderness by Mitis 4 out of 10. All right, and that is about it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Let me know what you thought of this track. Let me know how you think it compares to other Mitis tracks. And let me know any thoughts you have not only about the lyrics of this track, but about lyrics in general. I've always wanted my channel to be a place of discussion. So whatever your thoughts you have about lyrics, what criteria you have about lyrics, any tracks that you think have lyrics that sound empty and emotional but actually have a deeper background to them, or lyrics that might be vague. There are tracks I like out there that have pretty vague lyrics, but because they don't feel like they're trying to convey as much emotion to them, it more so contributes to the movement of the track instead of trying to give it empty emotion. There are some tracks like that out there. But other than that, like I said, you guys can let me know what you think. Let me know if you agree with my rating. Let me know if you disagree. And of course, you can let me know any other thoughts you have down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. But other than that, that is all I have for you. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.